The stranger's final prayer. The dust had settled so deep into Samuel Hartwell's bones that he reckoned it might never wash out, even if the rains did come again. He stood on his front porch, weathered hands gripping the cedar rail his grandfather had hewn from timber cut right here on this very land, and surveyed what remained of the Double H Ranch. Where green pastures once rolled like God's own carpet clear to the horizon, now stretched an endless expanse of cracked earth, baked hard as pottery and split wide enough to swallow a man's boot whole. The stock pond that used to mirror the sky had dried to nothing but a crater of hard pan clay, littered with the bleached bones of cattle that didn't make it through the last winter. Even the old oak tree, the one his grandmother used to say was older than Texas itself, stood naked and gray, its branches reaching skyward like the arms of a beggar. 7 years, 7 long, merciless years since the last real rain had blessed this corner of West Texas. Oh, they'd had the occasional sprinkle, the kind that barely dampened the dust before the sun sucked it right back up into the cloudless sky, but nothing that could bring life back to the land that had sustained 4 generations of Hartwell. Samuel's great-grandfather had claimed this spread in 1884, back when the buffalo still grazed these plains and the Comanche rode the wind. His grandfather had built it into something fine, running cattle fat as butter and horses swift as prayer. His daddy had weathered the Great Depression here, stubborn as the mesquite that refused to die no matter how deep you cut the roots. And Samuel had been fixing to pass it all down to his own boy Tommy before the drought took hold and Tommy took off for Dallas, chasing dreams that didn't involve watching everything you loved wither away to dust. Ain't natural, Samuel muttered to himself, a habit he'd picked up since his wife Martha passed 2 springs back. The doctor said it was her heart, but Samuel knew better. Hearts don't just give out for no reason. Hearts break, and Martha's broke watching their life's work turn to ash and bone. The sun hung like a malevolent eye in the bleached-out sky, promising another day of heat that would make a man's soul shrivel up like old leather. Samuel was fixing to head inside, maybe pour himself 3 fingers of the bourbon he'd been saving for better times, though he was beginning to suspect those times might never come when he spotted movement on the far horizon. A figure walked along the old farm road, shimmering in the heat like a mirage. But as the minutes passed and the figure grew larger, Samuel realized this was no trick of the light. Someone was actually fool enough to be walking in this heat in this god-forsaken country where even the buzzards had given up and moved on. The stranger approached slowly, methodically, like a man who had all the time in the world and nowhere particular to be. He was tall and lean, built like a fence post, with long gray hair that hung loose around his shoulders and a beard that reached nearly to his belt. His clothes were simple, faded denim and a white cotton shirt that somehow managed to look clean despite the dust that coated everything else in this part of the world. Samuel watched him come, curious despite himself. Strangers were rare out here, especially ones traveling on foot. The nearest town was Millfield, population 2047 on a good day, and that was a good 20 miles east. Before that you had to go clear back to Amarillo to find anything resembling civilization. The old man, for that's what he was, Samuel could see now, somewhere north of 70 by the look of him, walked right up to the front gate and stopped. He didn't call out or wave, he just stood there, patient as stone, waiting. Samuel made his way down from the porch, his boots crunching on the dead grass that used to be Martha's pride and joy. She'd spent hours tending that lawn, coaxing it through dry spells with precious well water, talking to it like it was one of her children. Now it lay brown and brittle, crackling underfoot like old parchment. "Help you with something?" Samuel called out as he approached the gate. The stranger smiled, and when he did, the lines around his eyes crinkled up like old leather. "Name's Ezekiel," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Samuel couldn't quite place. Might have been Arkansas, might have been Oklahoma. Somewhere east anyway. "I was wondering if you might spare a tired old man a drink of water and maybe a place to rest for the night." Samuel studied him carefully. The man's eyes were clear and honest, the color of winter sky, and something about his manner put Samuel at ease despite the strangeness of the situation. Still, a man couldn't be too careful, especially out here where the nearest neighbor was 10 miles away and the sheriff even further. "Where you headed?" Samuel asked. "Nowhere in particular," Ezekiel replied. "Just walking, following the Lord's path wherever it might lead." A preacher then, or one of those wandering holy men that sometimes passed through, full of fire and brimstone and empty promises about better days ahead. Samuel had heard enough sermons to last him 3 lifetimes, and not a one of them had brought so much as a single drop of rain. But Martha had raised him to be hospitable, and despite everything that had happened, he wasn't about to turn away a man who looked like he might collapse from heat exhaustion at any moment. "Well," Samuel said, working the latch on the gate, "I reckon I can spare some water. Can't promise much for supper though. Pickings are pretty lean around here these days." "The Lord provides," Ezekiel said simply, and something in the way he said it made Samuel believe he truly meant it. They walked up to the house together, the stranger's worn boots silent on the hard-packed earth. Samuel noticed that despite the heat and the long walk, Ezekiel wasn't sweating, wasn't even breathing hard. That struck him as odd, but then again some folks were just built different. The inside of the house was marginally cooler than the outdoors, though not by much. The old window unit Martha had insisted on buying 5 years back had given up the ghost last summer, and Samuel hadn't seen the point in fixing it. What was the point of cooling a house when there was nothing left to cool it for? Samuel pumped water from the kitchen tap. The well was still good, thank the Lord for small mercies, and handed Ezekiel a tall glass. The old man drank deeply, gratefully, then set the glass down and looked around the kitchen with those pale eyes. "Beautiful home," he said. "I can feel the love that went into building it. My wife's touch," Samuel said gruffly. "She had a way with making things feel like home. She's passed on 2 years ago this spring." Ezekiel nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry for your loss. The good ones always seem to go first, don't they?" Samuel found himself nodding before he could stop himself. There was something about this stranger that invited confidence, that made a man want to unburden himself of the weight he'd been carrying. "She loved this place more than life itself," Samuel heard himself saying. "Used to say the land had its own spirit, its own way of talking to folks who knew how to listen. Course it ain't had much to say these past few years except goodbye." They sat at the kitchen table as the afternoon wore on, and somehow Samuel found himself telling Ezekiel things he hadn't spoken aloud to another soul. About the cattle he'd had to sell off year by year as the grass disappeared. About the banknotes coming due and the property taxes that never seemed to get any smaller no matter how little he had left. About Tommy, his boy, who'd begged him to sell out and come to the city where there were jobs and air conditioning and a future that didn't depend on the whims of weather. "But this is all I know," Samuel said, surprised at how good it felt to finally voice the words. "4 generations of Hartwells have worked this land. My great-granddaddy used to say that a man's roots run as deep as the trees he plants, and I planted myself here a long time ago." Ezekiel listened to it all without judgment, occasionally asking a question or making a soft sound of understanding. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky the color of old blood, he finally spoke. "Tell me about the rain," he said. Samuel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What's to tell? Used to come regular like spring storms that would roll in from the Gulf, summer thunderheads that built up tall as mountains and dropped enough water to keep everything green and growing. Winter snows that soaked deep into the earth, storing up for the dry times. When did it stop? 7 years ago this August. Had a late summer storm that dumped 3 inches in one afternoon, and I remember thinking how grateful I was for it. Little did I know it would be the last real rain I'd see." Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at the devastated landscape beyond. When he spoke again his voice was soft, thoughtful. "You know, I've walked through a lot of dry places in my time. Deserts where nothing grows but thorns and the bones of things that used to live. But I've learned something about dry places. They're not punishments, they're preparation. Preparation for what? For the rain that's coming." Samuel wanted to laugh, wanted to tell this old fool that he'd been hearing that same promise from every snake oil salesman and traveling preacher who'd passed through in the last 7 years. But something in Ezekiel's eyes stopped him. There was a certainty there, a quiet confidence that seemed unshakable. "You sound pretty sure about that," Samuel said instead. "I am." Ezekiel reached across the table and placed his weathered hand on Samuel's arm. "The rain is coming. But first, the land has to be ready to receive it. Sometimes that means everything has to die first, so that what comes after can be truly new." They had a simple supper of beans and cornbread, washed down with coffee that Samuel had been stretching for weeks. Ezekiel ate with the appreciation of a man who understood the value of every morsel, and when they were finished, He insisted on helping with the dishes despite Samuel's protests. As darkness fell across the parched landscape, they sat on the front porch, listening to the sounds of the night. Even those were different now. No frogs singing from the stock pond, no cattle lowing in the distance, no rustle of wind through green leaves, just the whisper of hot air moving through dead grass and the distant call of a coyote somewhere out in the wasteland that used to be prime grazing land. "Mind if I ask you something?" Samuel said. "Ask away. What's a man your age doing walking across country? You got family somewhere? People worried about you?" Ezekiel was quiet for so long that Samuel began to think he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice seemed to come from somewhere far away. "I had a farm once, up in Arkansas, good land, rich soil, plenty of water, raised corn and soybeans, had a few head of cattle, wife named Ruth, sweet as honey and twice as golden, 3 children, 2 boys and a girl." He paused, and Samuel could hear the weight of memory in his silence. "Lost it all in '08. Banks called in the loans and I couldn't make the payments. Ruth took sick not long after we lost the farm, and the treatments, well, they cost more than we had. She passed and kids scattered to the 4 winds, chasing their own dreams. Can't say I blame them. So you just started walking." "Not right away. Spent a few years trying to figure out what comes next when everything you built your life around is gone. Worked odd jobs, stayed in shelters, tried to drink away the pain. But the Lord has a way of calling a man back to his purpose, even when that man thinks his purpose died with everything else. And your purpose is walking." Ezekiel smiled. "My purpose is going where I'm needed, and right now I'm needed here." They talked until late into the night, sharing stories and silences with equal comfort. Samuel found himself opening up in ways he hadn't since Martha passed, telling Ezekiel about his childhood on the ranch, about meeting Martha at a church social in Millfield, when they were both 19, about the dreams they'd shared and the life they'd built together. When they finally turned in, Samuel made up the couch for his guest, but Ezekiel politely declined. "If it's all the same to you, I'd prefer to sleep outside. I've gotten used to having the stars for company." Samuel provided him with a blanket and a pillow, and watched as the old man made himself comfortable on the porch swing that Martha used to love so much. Within minutes, Ezekiel appeared to be fast asleep, his breathing deep and even. But Samuel lay awake in his empty bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what the stranger had said. "The rain is coming." It seemed impossible after 7 years of watching the sky tease and promise and deliver nothing but more heat and heartbreak. And yet, there had been something in the old man's voice, a certainty that went beyond hope or wishful thinking. It was the kind of faith that Samuel had once possessed himself, back when he was young and the future stretched out ahead of him like an endless green pasture. Sometime in the small hours of the morning, Samuel finally drifted off to sleep, and when he did, he dreamed of rain. He woke to the sound of humming, a low melodic sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sunlight was already streaming through the bedroom windows, and Samuel realized he'd slept later than he had in months. He dressed quickly and went to find Ezekiel. The old man was kneeling in what used to be Martha's garden, his hands pressed flat against the cracked earth. He was still humming, and as Samuel got closer, he realized it was an old hymn, "How Great Thou Art," sung so softly it was barely audible. "Morning," Samuel called out, not wanting to startle him. Ezekiel looked up and smiled. "Good morning. I hope you don't mind. I was just having a conversation with your soil." "Come again?" "The earth has a voice if you know how to listen. Your land is tired, Samuel, bone tired. But it's not dead. It's just waiting." Samuel looked around at the devastation, at the cracked hardpan and the skeletal remains of what used to be productive farmland. Waiting for what? For permission to begin again. Before Samuel could ask what that meant, Ezekiel stood and brushed the dust from his knee. "Would you mind if I stayed another day or two? There's something I need to do here, and it might take a little time." Samuel had been hoping the old man would stay longer anyway. It had been good to have someone to talk to, someone who understood the weight of loss and the burden of holding on to hope when hope seemed foolish. "Stay as long as you like," he said. "Lord knows I've got nothing but time these days." Ezekiel spent that day walking the perimeter of the ranch, stopping every so often to kneel and place his hands on the ground. Sometimes he would close his eyes and remain motionless for long minutes. Other times he would cup his ear to the earth as if listening for something only he could hear. Samuel followed at a distance, curious but reluctant to intrude. There was something deeply personal about what Ezekiel was doing, something that felt like prayer made manifest in the physical world. That evening, as they shared another simple meal, Samuel finally worked up the courage to ask, "What exactly are you doing out there?" "Preparing," Ezekiel said simply. "For what?" "For what's coming." It was the same answer he'd given before, and just as cryptic, but Samuel was beginning to understand that Ezekiel wasn't being deliberately evasive. He was a man who dealt in certainties that couldn't be explained in ordinary terms, who operated on a frequency that most people couldn't quite tune into. The second night passed much like the first, with Ezekiel sleeping on the porch, and Samuel lying awake thinking about rain and redemption and the strange peace that had settled over him since the old man's arrival. On the third morning, Samuel woke to find Ezekiel standing in the center of what used to be the front pasture, his arms raised toward the sky. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern horizon, and in the soft light of dawn, the old man looked like something out of an ancient story, a prophet calling down blessings on a barren land. Samuel made coffee and waited, and after a while Ezekiel came back to the house. There was something different about him today, a sense of completion, as if some great work had been finished. "It's time," he said simply. "Time for what?" "Time for me to go, and time for you to receive what's been promised." Samuel felt a sudden panic at the thought of being alone again. "You don't have to leave, you're welcome to stay as long as you want." Ezekiel smiled and placed a gentle hand on Samuel's shoulder. "I've done what I came here to do, the rest is up to forces greater than either of us." They ate breakfast together one last time, and then Ezekiel gathered his few belongings and prepared to leave. At the front gate he turned back to look at Samuel with those clear winter sky eyes. "The rain is coming," he said again. "When it does, don't just let it wash over you. Let it wash through you. Let it carry away everything that needs to go, and let it water everything that needs to grow." "Where will you go?" Samuel asked. "Wherever I'm needed next." Ezekiel smiled. "Take care of yourself, Samuel Hartwell, and take care of this good land. It's got more life left in it than you know." With that he turned and walked away, heading west this time toward the mountains that rose like purple shadows on the horizon. Samuel watched until he was nothing but a speck in the distance, then stood there a while longer, feeling the weight of solitude settle back onto his shoulders like an old familiar coat. The day passed slowly, as they all did now. Samuel found himself walking the same paths Ezekiel had walked, kneeling in the same spots where the old man had knelt. He couldn't hear whatever Ezekiel had heard in the earth, couldn't feel whatever he had felt, but something was different. There was an expectancy in the air, a sense of potential that hadn't been there before. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Samuel noticed something on the horizon. Cloud. Not the thin wispy things that sometimes drifted overhead like false promises, but real clouds, tall and dark and pregnant with possibility. He stood on his porch and watched them build, growing taller and darker as the minutes passed. Lightning began to flicker in their depths, and thunder rolled across the empty landscape like the voice of God himself. The first drops began to fall just as darkness claimed the sky, fat, heavy drops that struck the parched earth with audible impacts, raising tiny puffs of dust with each strike. Samuel stood in the gathering storm, tilting his face up to receive the gift he'd been praying for 7 long years. The rain began in earnest then, falling in sheets that swept across the land like a curtain being drawn. Samuel stood in it until he was soaked to the skin, laughing and crying at the same time, feeling the water wash away years of dust and despair and desperate hope. It rained all night, it rained for 3 days straight. When it finally stopped, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The cracked earth had softened and filled, drinking deep of the precious water it had been denied for so long. Green shoots began to appear within days, grass and wildflowers and the tender leaves of trees that everyone had given up for dead. The stock pond filled for the first time in years, and within a week, Samuel spotted the first cattle egret he'd seen since the drought began, standing knee-deep in the shallows and fishing for minnows that had somehow survived in the deep mud. Tommy called from Dallas, having heard about the rains on the weather report. "Dad? Dad? Is it true? Did you really get 6 inches? 7.5, Samuel corrected, grinning at the phone. "And it looks like more on the way." "I'll be damned," Tommy breathed. "After all this time." "Dad, I've been thinking, maybe I could come home for a visit, help you get things started again." Samuel's throat tightened with emotion. "I'd like that, son. I'd like that very much." The rains continued through the summer, not in the devastating torrents of that first storm, but in the gentle regular patterns that Samuel remembered from his youth. The land responded with an eagerness that spoke of deep unquenchable thirst, finally being satisfied. By fall the Double H Ranch was green again, not fully recovered, that would take time, but alive in a way it hadn't been for 7 years. Samuel hired back some of the hands he'd had to let go, started rebuilding his herd with cattle he bought at auction with money borrowed against the promise of good grass and clean water. He never saw Ezekiel again, though he often found himself looking toward the horizon, half expecting to see that familiar figure walking up the road. Sometimes in the evening when the light was just right, he thought he could feel the old man's presence, as if his prayers had somehow taken root in the soil itself. Tommy came home for Christmas and decided to stay, bringing with him a wife and a baby daughter who took her first steps on grass that grew thick and green where drought had once ruled supreme. They talked about expanding the operation, maybe building a new barn where the old one had been torn down during the lean years. On New Year's Eve, as Samuel stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, he raised a glass of that bourbon he'd been saving and spoke to the wind. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the stranger, for the rain, for the chance to begin again." The wind carried his words away across the restored land, past the full stock pond and the green pastures where cattle grazed contentedly in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, not the threatening sound of storm, but the gentle promise of more rain to come. And Samuel Hartwell, fourth-generation rancher and keeper of the faith, smiled and went inside to join his family for dinner, knowing that some prayers are answered not with words but with the simple profound miracle of water falling from the sky onto land that was ready at last to receive it.